Hey guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and if you remember back earlier this summer, I built my sister a console that had all the bells and whistles, and she was going to be using it as a dog crate and a dresser in one. But today I'm going to be showing you the matching nightstands, so if you're ready to get building, let's go. My sister has two dogs. The bigger one gets the console and the smaller one gets the nightstand. I built her these dog crate nightstands several years ago, but it's time to switch them out for something a little nicer and something that matches the new console. This nightstand design obviously works fine as a dog crate, but if you don't need the crate function, it works fine as a storage cabinet too. I've got the plans, materials list, and all the details linked in the description, so if you want to build your own, head over after this video. To get started, the first thing I did was start cutting down my plywood sheet. I was able to build two of these nightstands from a single sheet of plywood plus about a quarter of a sheet. I used my circular saw and rip cut to rip two strips from the full sheet to make the sides and the bottom of the cabinets. Then I used my AccuCut and circular saw to cut these strips down to their final size. If you're interested in learning more about how I cut down my plywood sheets, I will link a video below for that. Each nightstand will have two side panels and a bottom panel. I didn't bother edge banding these pieces since the edges will be covered later with a face frame. I just sanded them a little and began assembly. I used pocket holes and screws to attach the bottom panel between the side panels. Now I attach these at the bottom just to give the dog a little more height once he's inside the crate. If you aren't using this as a dog crate, you can install this bottom panel a little bit further up so that it'll be flush across the bottom once the face frame is attached later. Either way works fine. Once the carcasses were together, I started working on the face frames and the support pieces. The face frames on these nightstands were made using 1x3s for the sides and a 1x4 at the bottom. I cut these to length and assembled using pocket holes and screws. Then I applied wood glue and used brad nails to secure this face frame to the front of the cabinet box. And you may be wondering why there isn't a top piece yet. So if you notice in the finished piece, the crown molding wraps around the 1x3 face frames. This was a detail that my sister wanted in the console that I built her, so I also wanted these nightstands to have the same matching detail. If you don't have the patience for cutting crown molding like this, it is a little tedious. Feel free to attach a top to the face frame so that it's flush instead of doing it this way. But I used pocket holes and screws to attach a 1x3 on the inside of the face frame here like shown. Then I added two scrap plywood supports on the top here to give me somewhere to attach the top and the backer later. Now for the fun details. My sister loves details, so whenever there's an opportunity to add some, we do. Just like with the matching console, I added some 1x3s on the bottom of the face frame, cutting to fit and then gluing and nailing into place. To top these pieces off, I added a little cove molding to fancy things up a little. And the last detail before I started working on what's inside of the cabinet was adding crown molding along the top. I cut to fit pieces to fit around the top edge, wrapping around the face frame, and glued and nailed these in place. Now, it would have made sense to attach the top before I did this, but I wanted to make sure that the top completely covered all of the crown molding after it was installed, so I wanted to install it first before I added the top. So instead, I used a scrap board just laid on top to help me figure out how high I needed to attach the crown molding. Once it was attached, I puttied the nail holes and the joints and moved on to the doors while the putty dried. One thing I did want to note here is that I added an additional face frame on the inside of the dresser console, which actually gave me a place to mount the Cremone bolt hardware for the doors. But since this piece was so much smaller, I could make the door quite a bit bigger if I didn't use this face frame, so that Wally had a little bit more room to walk in and out of the crate. Now, that also meant that I couldn't use Cremone bolt hardware for this piece, so we opted for a different style latch, just in case you were wondering. I built the doors similar to the console with 1x3s on the sides and bottom and a 1x6 at the top. I used a round object and then kind of just free-handed the rest of the curve on the top and cut it out with a jigsaw. Then I used dowels to assemble this door frame. You could use pocket holes and screws here if you wanted. I just didn't want to have to deal with plugging the holes, so I used dowels instead. Once the glue was dry, I sanded them down and painted them black. While that was drying, I cut some hardware mesh pieces to add to the middle of these doors. I spray painted them black as well, and once everything was good and dry, I stapled them onto the back side of the door frame. Now, the cut ends of this mesh sheet are pretty rough, so I used some thin scrap strips to cover over these rough edges, just stapling them in place. Then I moved on to the drawer. Since this has a face frame, I needed to install some bracing to mount the drawer slides flush to the inside of the frame so that they are able to slide in and out. You can do this 1,000 ways, but I just used some scrap plywood and attached everything using pocket holes and screws so that there was a piece that ran in the back side to side between the side panels, and then 2 pieces that ran between that piece and the front of the face frame mounted flush, and I made sure that all of my spacing was correct so my drawer can easily slide in and out. Once the bracing was installed, I could mount the slides onto these stretchers and start building the drawer. These drawer fronts will have a decorative edge that will make the overall thickness of the drawer 1 inch. So I mounted these slides so that they are 1 inch in from the front of the face frame. For the drawer, I used some scrap plywood because I have a ton of scrap plywood, but you could also use 1x4s as well. I cut the pieces to length, cut a dado along the bottom edge, and assembled it with pocket holes and screws. If you want to know more about building drawers, I have a super detailed guide for how to measure for, build, and install drawers that I will link below. I slid a 1/4 inch plywood panel into the bottom of the drawer before adding the final piece of the box. Then I installed it into the nightstand. Just like with the console, I made these drawer fronts so that they will have a 1 inch wide trim piece wrapped around the edges. I cut the middle from 3/4 inch plywood and then just nailed these 1 inch wide by 3/4 inch thick pieces around the edges. Then I installed these onto the drawer. Finally, I cut, edge banded, and installed the top panel so that it fit perfectly over the crown molding. I screwed this in place through the top supports of the nightstand and nailed the crown to it in a few places along the top. After all the putty was sanded well, I applied stain to the nightstand and then polyed it. And the last step was just stapling a 1/4 inch backer over the back side. Then I installed the door using some small decorative butt hinges. I underestimated the thickness of these butt hinges before installing them, and I ended up having to trim a little bit off of the edge of my door for everything to fit. Alright, let's try this again. So once I trimmed about a blade width off of my doors, I was able to install them using these butt hinges, and I just touched up the paint. Perfect. If you weren't wanting to use these as dog crates, you could leave this large cabinet underneath for storing large items, or use a shelf pin jig and drill holes to add pins for adjustable shelves to make the most of your storage space. However, if you do drill the shelf pin holes, I recommend doing it before you attach the back, because this door is a pretty tight space to crawl into. And now they're finished and ready to use. I'm not much on traditional style furniture with all the fancy moldings, but I must say this dresser and nightstand set is pretty slick. Dog crate or not, these are great for adding some style and storage to your bedroom or even to your living room as a TV console and side tables. If you'd like to build some for yourself, be sure to head over and grab the plans I've linked below and get building. If you aren't already subscribed to my channel, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on what's coming next. And thanks so much for watching, and until next time, happy building.